Discussion: phpMyAdmin versus MySQL Monitor. Describe the process of exporting the structure and content of a table from one database and importing it into another database using phpMyAdmin. As you see it, what are the pros and cons using phpMyAdmin tools versus MySQL Monitor? You're also to provide examples where appropriate. Okay, so I'm going to make a video response to our discussion this week. I hope it's helpful to some of you, and so let's get started. A few months ago I actually released or finished a project with which to deploy Docker containers for Joomla and phpMyAdmin for local and online collaborative initiatives around certain projects. I've made this script public, so you can actually access it on this URL right there. And to install it, it's only for Ubuntu at the moment. If you'd like to run it on another operating system, you may want to use a tool like this, Oracle VPN VirtualBox Manager, and then in that set up a Ubuntu machine, and then you would just run this script in that. It's very similar to setting up the Docker Compose script. You basically run these two commands and then you're ready to go. First time you run this script, it will ask you a bunch of questions, and from thereafter you should have a very easy way to deploy containers in your system. So I've already done that, so it's already running on many of my developing systems, and so I'm not going to show you all that boring part of this tutorial. Just to explain to you how easy it is to set it up, I'll show you just so quickly a bit of that. Yeah, just quickly. So here I'm in my terminal on Ubuntu, and I will type in octoyum. Let me just get this octoyum and enter. It will greet me with a step-by-step sort of menu. And okay, so I'm gonna add a Joomla container, set up a new container. I'm gonna choose 4.0 and as the Joomla version I want to deploy, and I'm gonna use, for some of these things you don't need to understand now. If you want to use the tool, probably you'll just read up on it. So I'll just call it week 6 for simplicity, and here I'll just choose the champion.me and week 6 again. I'm going to let it set up my database values for me, so I'm just going to click enter, so it sets that up. I'm going to let it add it to the host file. Since we're in a local machine, local instance, it will be useful that I can open it in the browser quickly. Okay, I'll do that for the database as well, so pay attention. The database has this DB part added, so it's week 6 DB champlain.me, which will be the place to look at the MySQL DB. Enter, and so there is the host file also being updated with that value, and our container is done. Now let's spin it up. Once it's spun up, it will show us the database values we need to continue with setting up the actual database. There we go. So we can open this URL in the browser, finish the linking between the database and the website data. So this process will actually initialize our database with some dummy data, and then we can look at actually answering the questions of this week's discussion. So here we are. I'm going to quickly run through this. Not much to see here right now, since we are actually just setting up the Joomla site. This moment is useful, and it is the moment we link the actual PHP script running on the server with the MySQL database. So in our building script that we ran, it gave us the passwords for it already initialized this database and these values, so we could just use those in this deployment. So for the password and the database. And then we must set up the host name correctly, as it is running in a container. The way the Docker containers link would be by this name and port. So we'll copy that in here instead of localhost, which is the usual way doing that on a shared server. There we go. The website is up and running. I'm logged into the back end, and as you can see, it is querying the database and it's bringing back from the database, for example, this user values, and also the articles. Okay, there's none. Let's see, there is at least uncategorized category, and a list of extensions that already are installed on the system, and much more. Okay, now let's look at the phpMyAdmin side of this website. Remember, we said that we need to type in just DB behind that week 6 enter, and there is phpMyAdmin. Now in our deployment script it gave us the root password, which I will use, and so we could just add that here with root as the user, and we can log in to our database. There is our database that it's created, and web-d is the prefix it's set, and as we saw, the user table is actually loading this data into this area of the site. Let's see. Yes, this data here comes from this table here, and so basically it's querying this table. So phpMyAdmin is a GUI kind of interface for your SQL database, and it allows you to do a whole host of things. For example, to export data, as one of the questions was to export data. These are the various formats available, but if you want to export it to import it in another database, you can either export the whole database, basically all the rows. Wait, this is only going to target the user database, but if you want to do the whole database, sorry, the user table, if you want to do the whole database, you just go up one and then exporting tables from actually the whole database. So if you want to export only a specific table, we go to that specific table like this one, and then click export. Then it's going to target just the rows of that table. So depending on what you really want to achieve, there is different ways of exporting the data and quantities you would like. Okay, so I'm going to just export the user table, but I'm going to do it by going back to the whole database and then click export, and instead of using quick, say custom. For in here you can see that you're able to select various tables, multiple tables, and you can decide to export either the structure or the data or both. So we're going to target the user table, it's this one here, and we're going to only export that. So scroll down. The defaults of all these settings are usually fine. If you know more about what it means, then you could tweak them, but I usually just leave the defaults as is and click go. So it will create the vdm_io.sql dump file, which we will then again use to import the data into our other table. So we have now this database. Let's create a new database, and we just call it new DB. We're going to choose a character set. Let's see. Well, in fact, again, the default here is quite fine. And once you create a new database and you also want to link a user to it, the best way to do that is just to create a new user instead of just creating a database. So let's show you that. You could click create here, and that should create the database. But if you want to create a user that is linked to a database all in one shot, you go to user accounts and here add new account, and then give it this new DB name, and have it set a password for you by clicking this generate. Now there's the password. You should copy it out and store it somewhere, and then here create database with same name and grant all privileges. That's what I would usually do, and say OK. And so there we go, we got our new DB here, and then we can import that export value into our database like that. And so now our database will have one table called webd user, and basically have the data that we exported. So importing, exporting tables and rows from one database into another is quite easy. There's obviously an easier way to do that in the same instance. If you wanted to copy a table, you could go to that table, then go to operations, and then it says there copy table to database, and we can select this new database and say structure and data, and then switch to the copy and go. And it's that quick, we'll see that it now has copied the table into this new database. So that's the faster internal. You don't need to download the file, don't need to upload it, just copy it from one to the other. That's quite simple and very useful at times for making backups of certain tables before you will make a change. The user interface of phpMyAdmin can really do a whole host of things, and in fact the more privileges you have as a user logged in, the more things there is to do. You can go into the global settings of the database and change all kinds of things, and yeah, probably not a good place to play around. Now, it's also in our discussion this week, it talks about the MySQL Monitor, and when Googling about the difference between MySQL Monitor and phpMyAdmin, we basically come to see that the one is a visual interface, whereas the other is more of a command line interface, as stated here. Something called command line MySQL tool. It's a client that comes with MySQL, MariaDB. It's simply a very useful way to type SQL and get it executed. Think of it as the shell version of the phpMyAdmin or Workbench. So that's what I could quickly discover from a few searches. And so at first I wasn't even sure what we are talking about, but then I realized, okay, I've actually used this a lot and didn't know that's what it's called. So to demonstrate the monitor, let's go to the terminal. If you've used my script, you'd probably want to just put this password somewhere that you can get to it, because it's most convenient to log in as root and to then be able to look around in the terminal at the same data as we are looking at right now here in phpMyAdmin. So in phpMyAdmin we see all these tables, databases and their tables and their rows, and you can do the same in terminal with the MySQL Monitor. One big difference in my case though is that I'm running in containers, so I need to first go into the container where my MySQL is deployed. To do that is very easy. It's docker -it and the name of the container, and I will just use bin .bash as the starting script. So here we are in the container, and now to get into the MySQL Monitor, which is basically a bash, or rather a shell interactive program with MySQL, you must run the following command: MySQL enter, MySQL-u root-p enter, and then that password I told you to keep handy, basically paste that in. You can use that way of pasting, or Control-Shift-V is how you paste in terminal. Enter, and there we go. We are in MariaDB Monitor, which is similar as MySQL Monitor. Now we don't have any database checked out or any tables, so that's why it has a none there in between these brackets here. But let's select something similar to what we've looked at in our GUI. To know what all the commands that are available here, you can try /h or for help. So first we run this show databases, and it shows us the same list of databases we see here in the phpMyAdmin. So it's the same databases we're looking at. There's the new DB we created earlier. We can then change to one of these databases by saying use and the database name, and then enter, and we are now on that database, and we can type show tables, and it will show us the tables in that database. So far, as you can see, it's very similar to what we have basically looking at it here. Now, as you can see, we have this console in phpMyAdmin, which if you click on something, it actually prints out a command. So let's try one of these commands and see what happens. Oh, I should have added a semicolon. And there we go. We see the same printout. My screen is a little cramped. So let me use rather one of the tables that might be more readable. But as you can see, it printed out the same values, just my screen is a bit small here. So I'm going to go to this user one and select that. So we're cheating. We're letting phpMyAdmin write our commands for us. In fact, that's one of the things you could use it for. And as you can see there, it printed out the column names. This thing, maybe I should try and zoom out a little here. Reference. Okay, it's very tiny now, but now at least you can see the columns. There's the ID column, the name column, the username, email, password. You see the same printout as what we are seeing here in the GUI. Okay, so that's terminal or MySQL Monitor, and that is phpMyAdmin. I'm sure the pros and cons are quite obvious. Besides that, it's a little bit more challenging to know how to actually navigate the MySQL Monitor. There is, though, the reality that it's probably more powerful and has less limitations, whereas phpMyAdmin, you may at times run up against some limitations which are imposed by the PHP actual script running on top of MySQL. In this case, MariaDB, which is the open source version, if I haven't said that already, of MySQL. So we can do similar things in here, which we can get the commands from here. So we could go delete and then say okay, and here it actually ran a script to delete a certain ID. Now we exported this table previously, right? So let's go back and let's drop the table. So let's go and drop it. It's okay, and then let's import that table again. just that one. And so we would have it that it is again having our details. Now we run that same command which we copied earlier, paste it in here, delete from user web, where user web ID equals that, enter, semicolon always, don't forget, and one row affected. And if we go here, refresh this, we'll see same thing happened, data is removed. Okay, I think that's quite clear that these two tools are quite similar and yet not similar. And the one is a command line interaction with the MySQL server, and the other one is a GUI web-driven tool that also does similar actions, except it helps you write the SQL queries, which I will then, again with the next discussion also this week, how to build queries. Yeah, I guess you know by now that we can use phpMyAdmin to write these queries for us, and so I hope to also make a tutorial about that. Well, thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.